You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have Clare Lopez. She is the Vice President for Research and Analysis with the Center for Security Policy. She is just an extraordinary expert, and we're so glad to have her back. Clare, welcome back with Brett and John.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for having me. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, we have a real loaded program today. We just got off with an expert on Asian and military systems. So we were discussing the threat of the Chinese and Russian advancements militarily and in space. And now we move back to the Middle East with you. And of course, all the things that we discuss with you are always an issue of national security and defense initiatives. And right now, it's very interesting. Let's just look at the overall picture. We have a president who has, declared before running and as soon as he took office that he has to get us out of these wars. He likes to use drones. He feels like he defeated Al-Qaeda. He's made some ridiculous statements, and the little boys group, ISIS, the not as threatening as Al-Qaeda, is very quickly taking over territory, blowing apart borders, killing a lot of people, taking over weapons, taking over oil fields, water supplies. I mean, it's amazing what ISIS is doing. And so I guess I would start with, does this president and the administration truly understand and recognize the threat of ISIS and any of the related groups? And two, when they come out and declare a strategy of no boots on the ground, is there any possible way that we're not going to fail without changing the strategy?
Well, lots to unpack here, for sure. The first thing I would say is that the Islamic State is a reality, and it is growing stronger, if not by the day, certainly by the week. But at the current point in time, the only territories that IS really threatens are two of Iranian puppet regimes, Baghdad and Damascus. That's it. They don't threaten anybody else, including they're certainly not an existential threat to the United States or anywhere else. If they grow stronger and if they take more territory, they could and apparently intend to expand, and we would have to take a look at our ally Jordan with a view to supporting them additionally, and maybe even Saudi Arabia. Now, the point of a good question here is the number one adversary one would think of the Islamic State would be the Shiite jihadist state of Iran. And yet they're not doing much of anything except kind of pushing us to join into the battle. Now, here's one more thing to consider. IS does many things. As you say, it absolutely governs as a state. It provides electricity and water, sewer systems, education. It builds clinics. It extracts taxes as well as extortion, extracts the jizya from conquered Christian populations and businesses, etc., runs oil wells. But one of the other things that it does is communications really, really well. And it's got an online, full-color, slick English-language magazine. It's called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q. Dabiq happens to be the name of a town in northern Syria. They're on their third issue now. And it's notable that the third issue of Dabiq talks about, it's called Join the Hijra, meaning come to the Islamic State, you Muslim jihadis of the world, all over the world, and join in the building of the new caliphate. That's what the issue is about. But in it, they talk about their vision of the end times. And their end time scenario goes something like this. They are in the territory that they consider to be key for their end time scenario, meaning Al-Sham. And indeed, that's what the old name ISIS stood for, Islamic State in Iraq and Al-Sham. In Arabic, that acronym would be Daesh. So that territory is the place they think the final battles are going to be fought, the final battles of their end time scenario, which they call Al-Mahamma. That's their Armageddon. But they can't have an Armageddon unless there are Crusader troops on the ground to fight against, because They can't fight the aerial bombardment that's coming at them. They got to have ground troops. And so this is what the parade of horrific human rights atrocity videos are all about. They're about luring and prodding the West, and in particular the United States, to join in that battle on the ground. They need us there. They have to have ground troops of what they would call the Crusaders in order to have their Malhamma. It's all spelled out in the Dabiq issue. No ground troops from the West, no Malhamma, no Armageddon, no end times. So we have to understand what their tactics, what their strategy are. And they desperately want to pull us into ground troop battle over there so they can have their end time scenario.
That's actually fascinating, what you've just introduced to us. And so if we do just take a greater step back, I think Iran has been the biggest terrorist supporter, biggest terrorist state. I mean, this is my opinion. I'm sure to some degree you'll agree, or maybe you'll wholly agree. But they are still the biggest threat. They are still the regime that's seeking the nuclear bomb. If they don't already have it, I'm sure they have most of the components. It's just a matter of time or putting it together. But they're working on a program that we seem to be negotiating an end game too. They also support a lot of the terrorist groups that not only fight against us, but against all of our allies, not just in the Middle East, but in other regions as well, in other continents. They've supplied weapons, they've supplied training, funding, you name it, going against our interests.
Absolutely.
So what's interesting to me, and you point out, and I mean, this is such a complex puzzle and web, because we're against ISIS. ISIS is against our natural enemies, and it's, so how do you figure out who's with who? And
well, here's how I would try to simplify it, maybe for the listeners here. What we need to start thinking about is who. I mean, this goes back to George W. Bush, like it or not. Are you with us or are you against us? Okay. If you're Muslim, and absolutely all Muslims do not want anything to do with this what's going on in the Middle East, with jihad, with IS or anybody else that's a jihadist. So the dividing line really is, are you a jihadist or not? Do you follow Sharia to fight jihad, to establish and impose Sharia? And fighting, of course, can be done in many ways, all of which are not violent. But are you or are you not a jihadist? That makes it very simple. Iran, the Iranian regime, is jihadist. The Saudi regime is jihadist. Islamic State is jihadist. This isn't rocket science. Now, let's go back in history just a little bit, because the origins of the Islamic State go back to the middle 2000s, when the Americans and other coalition partners were fighting in Iraq against a guy whose name you might recall, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was al-Qaeda. He was killed in 2006. Now, who was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's number one sponsor, defender, and safe haven? It was Iran. It was the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Quds Force of Iran. That's where his men went for medical care, or when things got too hot. They fled over the border into Iran, and the Iranians gave them safe haven and help. Okay, now put that away and look now. Let's move forward. The successor to AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's old outfit, is the Islamic State. When they fled out of Iraq, fleeing away from American troops and others who, under the surge, David Petraeus, and after al-Zarqawi was killed, they fled and they went to Syria. There, in 2011, as the rebellion broke out against Bashar al-Assad, these were some of the jihadi rebels that fought against Bashar al-Assad, although not too much. Mostly, they fought against other rebels. And Bashar al-Assad and the Iranian IRGC, which is in Syria too, to prop him up, and Hezbollah, the Iranian Shiite terror proxy, kind of left ISIS at that time alone. they didn't go after them. Now, after they've swept south back into Iraq again, we see the Kurds fighting hard against IS, the Islamic State, as they now call themselves, or the Caliphate. But we still don't see Iran doing much. And now there is word that other al-Qaeda elements around the world, AQAP, their top bomb maker, Ibrahim al-Asiri, is reported to be teaming up with IS, as well as the Khorasan group, which, by the way, is the al-Qaeda unit in Iran. AQIM elements have joined IS. Yemeni-based elements have joined IS. All the way out to Pakistan, Tariq-e-Taliban Pakistan has joined IS. So you've got this slow shift of old al-Qaeda units moving over now and teaming up with the Islamic State. And who are al-Qaeda's closest allies? Iran. So I'm back to my first premise. Dar al-Harb, that is the land where Sharia is not yet imposed, and Dar al-Islam. We are not yet under Sharia law. That is Dar al-Harb. The rest are Dar al-Islam. Jihadis versus the non-jihadis versus the West.
That's very interesting again. You made me think of something, and it's a question I guess we have to ask two administrations, but when you set forth with an operation, for instance, in Afghanistan, where you're going after the Taliban and al-Qaeda or whoever, you know that they're going to run in a certain direction. Why weren't we prepared to cut them off before they left Afghanistan into Pakistan? And the same thing in Iraq, how are we not prepared to drop down along the Iranian border to stop them and catch them in the wet?
Kind of the same reason in both cases. You'll recall that the final battles of Tora Bora were fought in late 2011 at the Afghan-Pakistan border. And what happened is that the United States forces allowed Afghan forces and Pakistani forces to sort of guard the pass. And they didn't. But not only that, what we have to realize is that only 1/3 of what used to be old al-Qaeda Central went across those mountains into Pakistan and set up that Shura Council in the cities of Quetta and other cities of Pakistan, Peshawar. 1/3 of the fleeing al-Qaeda Shura Councils, 1/3 went to Iran. They already had that set up in advance because, of course, Iran and al-Qaeda worked together on 9/11. So Iran was ready to receive hundreds of al-Qaeda fighters that went there. And then the last batch that we're talking about, you were thinking of the bunch that went with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. How did he get to Iraq? Think of the geography. Out of Afghanistan, he had to cross Iran to get to Iraq. And the Iranians helped him to do that. So again, you've got these alliances, and we've got to understand what the alliances are. The Islamic State and al-Qaeda are the same thing. They're jihadis. Their objectives are caliphate and Sharia. They might be rivals at certain levels that are tactical and on the ground, but essentially they're allies. They are also both allies in some sense of Iran. So what we have to think about as we contemplate putting ground troops over there, whom are we going to help and whom are we going to defend? Iranian satrapies in Baghdad and Damascus? Are we going to go and help jihadi rebels in Syria, like we've already done? The weapons out of Benghazi, for instance, that went there, including man-pads, surface-to-air weapons, missiles. Whom are we intending to help here? Somebody's got to give some thought to this.
Claire, I think this is actually a very, very important thread because your astute analysis that it's really jihadis against, let's just call them the civilized man, and we have jihadis on both sides. Now, we have a big problem here because we essentially have, for a long time, strategically been aligned to the Sunni jihadis against the Shia or Shiite jihadis, meaning Iran. With that in mind, Saudi, at least on the surface, appears to have had a slight wake-up call to the fact that the jihadi children they gave birth to are coming home to possibly destroy and overthrow the regime. Do you think that this is actually a change of heart and that their funding of the madrasas and all this radicalism around the world is likely to come to an end, or are they just hoping that they'll continue to live a life of gold-plated luxury and will pay the price in treasure and blood?
Well, I suppose you probably know the answer to that one. The most pressing concern for any of these monarchies in the Persian Gulf, Saudis, or any of the others, is regime self-preservation. Now, the Saudis are in an especially interesting pickle, of course, just as you said, because they nurtured a viper in their own nest. They nurtured jihadist elements. Of course, when people talk about, well, when is Islam going to have a reformation? Why don't they have a reformation and then everything will be fixed, right? Well, they already had a reformation. It's called Wahhabism. Ibn Wahhab, the 18th century figure, religious clerical Sunni figure of Islam, is the direct analogy for Martin Luther. Ibn Wahhab tried to take Islam back to its roots, back to a literal reading of the scripture of the Quran, to divest Islam of abuses that had sprung up, as in with Martin Luther, trying to do away with abuses like the selling of indulgences and such things for money. That was the Islamic Reformation. It already happened. And the Wahhabists were nurtured and welcomed and allied with by the ruling family, what became the ruling family of the Arabian Peninsula, Ibn Saud and the Saudis. That's why it's called Saudi Arabia. It's a country that's run by a family. And that family made a deal with the Wahhabis. They will protect politically, militarily, the clerical establishment of the Wahhabis, and the Wahhabis in turn lend spiritual legitimacy to the regime of the Saudis. And the problem is that, just as you say, the rulership in Riyadh is not and has not ever been exactly living the pure Islamic life. They know that the Islamic State is far more pure in its practice of Islam. Yes, the amputations, the beheadings, the crucifixions, the execution of prisoners of war, the sexual slavery and sex rapes and all of that, that is pure Islam. And how is it pure Islam? Because it comes directly out of the Sirat, the biography that comes down to us through the Islamic traditions of the biography, the life of Muhammad. And they're not living that life, obviously. And so they're vulnerable. The Saudis are very vulnerable, and so are these other Gulf sheikdoms. They know it. So how can they go to war against an entity that declares itself the caliphate, lives and behaves as Muhammad did? What are they going to say? What can they do? They're in a tough spot, but yes, the chickens are coming home to roost.
Now, this is also very awkward for us because not only do we have a mixed bag of frenemies, we've talked, the last time you were on, for example, we spoke about Qatar, but if you look at the natural alignment between Israel, the USA, and EU are really almost in that same exact boat, which is we're really stuck in a very rough neighborhood that we can't extract ourselves from, but there is no easy answers. And I wanted to get your analysis on, as an extension of that comment. To me, I think Iran is the one who is actually enjoying the greatest benefit from the ISIS phenomenon, because behind the scenes it feeds their sort of radicalist thirst. But basically it is a distraction. The single largest threat, in my opinion, is Iranians' acquisition of nuclear weapons and the delivery systems to deliver and the protection systems to keep us from doing anything about it. And ISIS puts us in a perfect patsy seat to distract us while Iran just keeps chugging along. And in that, we're kind of stuck in this in the same position, really, that Israel is to some degree. But I sort of feel like we're going to end up having to rely on Israel to do something about it, as it seems they made a small attempt 2 days ago.
Well, I think you're exactly right about who's benefiting here. It is the Iranians. And don't forget what I said earlier about the alliance among Iran, Al-Qaeda, and possibly even the Islamic State, not to mention the Khorasan group, which again is the Al-Qaeda unit that operated inside Iran and now sent a recruitment team over to Syria, and that's what our Director of National Intelligence referred to in testimony a couple weeks ago. But there is another alternative in the Middle East here, and I would suggest that our natural allies, of course, in addition to Israel, which of course is our best and oldest ally in that area, the Jordanians certainly as well, but it's the Kurds. The Kurds are Muslim, they are Sunni, but they're not jihadis and haven't been for quite a long time, even though Saladin, by the way, was a Kurd. But the point being that they are now pro-Western. They are looking to establish a modern, representative government in their ethnic region, which does stretch across a number of countries, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. Largest nation of people on the face of the earth that have never had their own country. But the Kurds are our natural allies. They are fighting hard, taking huge losses against the Islamic State. And they're tough fighters, the Peshmerga, those who face death. But what they don't have is the level of modern weaponry that IS now has, thanks to the Iraqi army that fled before them and dropped everything, including their uniforms and their weapons, top-of-the-line U.S. equipment that we had given to the Iraqi army. Now IS has all that, and the Kurds don't.
Which is absolutely incredible. Claire?
Yeah, what we need to do is arm the Kurds.
Absolutely, Claire, I'm sorry, but we're actually running out of time today. And so your analysis is wonderful, and we really do appreciate it, as do our listeners. And we look forward to picking up this conversation next time. But could you please share the website and your Twitter handle for the center and your Twitter?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am, at Clare M. Lopez on Twitter, and the center's website is centerforsecuritypolicy.org.
Excellent. And thanks again so much, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you.